Good morning. I suspect I will be slow to get folks on today because the link I posted actually had a time that was off by a hair. So I'm just telling Twitter we're going live. Give me a second. This is the joy of managing your own social media. Um, got it? Okay, so good morning, everyone. We already have a couple people on. I'm going to adjust this just a hair, so I hope it's not too disorienting. I think I might have finally found something at about the right height. Um, it's a paper shredder, so I've used books, I've used a bunch of other stuff. This seems to be the height that works. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. That is usually how we do the Q&A, so it's sort of the equivalent of what you'd see at a town hall where folks pass in note cards and they're asked of the person who's speaking. This is a particularly informal setting on Saturday mornings because it's really early on a Saturday. And so there's a lot that has happened this week, like every week, but I want to make sure that I'm adapting to whatever the audience is looking for. We do have a couple plugs in. Again, if you have any questions or if you'd like to know anything at all, I'll answer almost anything. There's a few things that are off limits. Just go ahead and drop the question in the chat. So this morning I had someone ask me, because the Powerball is up to over $1 billion lottery. What are we going to do about wealth inequality where we are struggling? And I think the answer is, of course, we need to do some stuff with taxation, but I think that we need to do reinvestment. We were sold in the 80s and 90s that trickle down was the way to go. I would argue that push-up is substantially more effective as a mechanism to invest in our communities. So I'd like to see us doing reinvestment programs that focus on return on investment. You don't just throw money on your problem and hope that it fixes it. You have to make sure that it has a lot of efficacy. So, for example, right now, a lot of our social services have very large cliffs. And they don't have nice ladders to get out. So if you make $1 or a few dollars more, suddenly you have no subsidy at all. The first comment is, good morning and thank you for getting out of bed wicked early. It is early. I was up a little too late last night on a movie night with our boys. So I am not as awake as normal at 8 a.m. on a Saturday. I'm usually pretty up and going at 8 a.m. generally, but not as much this morning. So we don't have a lot of social supports to get people out of poverty. And why that matters is we have a lot more people getting thrown into poverty right now. Our society treats poverty like it's some sort of personal failing instead of a structural issue. It's not. I mean, for almost all people who are stuck in poverty, it has nothing to do with personal failings. I think that as a society, we sort of silently decided that if it's a personal failing, it won't impact us, but it can impact anyone. So Portland is not in the 2nd Congressional District, but is in Maine. And right now they're struggling massively with rentals and massively with housing prices, and that is spreading. There are other areas in the state that are also experiencing that. It is really easy to lose your housing, and I think people don't understand just how easy it is to lose housing. Once you lose housing, it's virtually impossible to get stabilized unless you have many more resources than if you had those resources. You wouldn't have lost your housing in the first place. And it's just one thing that can throw you out of housing. It can be, not having the money to renew your car registration. It could be not having enough hours at your first or your second or sometimes your third job. I've worked 3 jobs at a time in my life. It can be not having the money for a medical bill. It can be student loan payments kicking in. It can be your adorable child just really, really, really wanting to go on a field trip and having to pick between that and maybe skip a meal to go on a field trip if it's one that costs funds. So there are a lot of things that can throw you very easily into poverty. And right now we don't have a system that helps people get out of it very well. So, I kind of talk about how the Republicans don't want there to be any system seemingly by their votes to get us into things. And the Democrats want to means test it in a way that means you are stuck or you can't get it in the first place. So what we need is a real social services system. We need much more generous food stamps. We need to be placing the burden for when people apply, not on the people who are applying. The applications themselves are a huge hurdle. I have a lot of clients that when they're separating, it's not that uncommon for one person to just shut off money entirely, and then the other person has absolutely no resources, no groceries, no way to pay anything. It's not appropriate. It also is something the courts eventually can usually handle, but it takes a while, and it could take several months for that issue to be resolved. You have to wait for your first court date. Then you have to get an order from the court. Sometimes they'll issue that day. Sometimes they want you to have another hearing. That other hearing might be, weeks or months away. Then they have to actually start following the order. Sometimes you have to have a motion to enforce. And you can have somebody who goes prolonged months without any resources. And that happens way more commonly than it should, which is how I become familiar with it presently. I've had other experiences in other ways earlier in my life. But I think a lot of people, one job loss very easily throws you into that system. And right now, the application processes that we have are so prohibitive. So if somebody is working, they often will have to take a whole day off of work to go down and apply for those services. And there's almost always snafus. They may not have childcare for that. And there's not a whole lot of sympathy from the folks who haven't experienced how to do it, as to how cumbersome it can be to get social services. So I think that we should be putting some federal dollars behind making a lot of those barriers go away. And there will be people that commit fraud. It's going to be the vast minority, and claw that back on their taxes. We know who they are. They've applied. They've given us a social security number to get those services. And if they make too much, there's a way to remedy that doesn't hurt people that really need that help right away. So it says the next first question that I got that looks maybe kind of substantive. The American with Disabilities Act of 1990 is a pet civil rights cause. What can we do to make Maine more compliant, particularly in relation to municipal buildings and vital businesses? So Maine, like a lot of states, but Maine in particular, the ADA is really hard here. Not that we should be conquering it. It's obviously not a new law. But Maine has both an aging population, which increases risks of disabilities, and it has an aging housing stock. We don't have a whole lot of buildings. So there's a lot of buildings that have needed adaptations. Actually, Bruce Poliquin tried to push something through that ended up putting more of the burden on the folks who were disabled to clarify the act. That didn't pass. That was very good that it didn't pass. I think that probably our biggest struggle on that are a lot of businesses that are not compliant, though most small businesses try as hard as they can to be compliant if you talk with them. And some are truly oblivious. A lot of businesses start with somebody opening a business in their house or the bottom floor of their house. That's not that uncommon in Maine. Or maybe they move to a nicer house and they turn their old house into a business, and it was fine for a house, but it's not compliant. And that's certainly an issue that we do have still in Maine with businesses. We certainly should be sending, I think, a little bit more funding to help smaller businesses get compliant. But I think it's a really problem with a lot of our housing, because most of our housing is old housing. Most of it is grandfathered into not necessarily needing housing. My house isn't ADA compliant. It wouldn't need to be. It was built in 1910. It's got stairs. It's got lots of stairs. It's got stairs I need to build on the back because we ripped them off because they rotted away. But for housing, you only need to have that compliance if you are renting to the public, it's needed, and you have a certain number of units. We definitely do not have enough units for our disabilities here. I think that's something that should be part of the housing bundle generally. This question was asked by Blue Boots. Sorry, I don't have a first name for you, or maybe Blue is it? It could be. That's a great name. If you want to be a little bit more specific in your question as to what you're looking for with municipal buildings and vital businesses being compliant, new buildings, new businesses are required to be compliant as they are built. I'm not personally aware of any new ones that are being built that are not. But we certainly have a lot of older ones that I know compliance is really difficult, especially if you're in old downtown areas. So many places have stairs. Many of those buildings don't have elevators, and many of them practically cannot. So if you want to be more specific, I can loop back around to that question. It definitely is a struggle in Maine. And any place you have older housing stock, it's going to be a problem. It's not just Maine. It's going to be less of a problem in some areas. So, for example, the Seattle area has a ton of new construction. You don't see many houses there that are over 40 or 50 years old. Most of the buildings get reconfigured all the time. It's got a very tear it down mentality on the West Coast. There aren't a whole lot of historic buildings that end up being there, and because the property values have gotten so high, they very frequently rip down housing and build new housing, a lot of which will be compliant. Some of which doesn't have to be compliant. Obviously, if you're building a single family home for yourself or even just to sell, it doesn't necessarily have to be compliant with ADA standards if there's not going to be nobody there that is going to have a disability. Otherwise, every house would have elevators or be single floor. But certainly, any major housing project is going to have a certain percentage that needs to be. So Gary asked, once elected, what committees would you be interested in serving on? Oh man, I wish I could do all of them. They're all very interesting. I think it is much less useful for the House than the Senate. I would like to sit on a judiciary committee, but the House doesn't perform the same function as the Senate. So I'm running for the House. That's not necessarily going to be something that is meaningful in a way that it would be for Mainers. I do like sitting on. I think it'd be very useful. There's a couple of committees that work with procurements. I'd really like to deal with healthcare. I'd really like to deal with reinvestments in our communities. Maybe education. I don't know. There's a finite amount of time, and there are way more committees than there is time. I'd also have to see whether there's openings and availability. I have chosen a stance that not everybody takes. In fact, nobody takes it. So there are a lot of people that have a huge problem with that, and they're welcome to. I have decided that because I'm an independent, my loyalty is to the law. It's not to one party or the other party. I kind of don't care about the parties. I want to be where the law is being made. So instead of caucusing with one party or the other, I've taken the stance that I would sort of walk to the table and ask to just be made a part of the conversation, and would caucus with wherever the majority is. In the House, it's extremely unlikely that I would be determinative of who's in the majority. But I do think it's important to be chasing the law, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. I just want to keep an eye on what's being done. I want to participate in what is likely to become actual law. Again, a lot of people don't necessarily like that stance, but most of those people are in parties, and I don't see a correlation between party and vote. They do, because right now we don't have independents in the House. So right now, if you are in a caucus, you are in that party in the House. It's not necessarily the same in the Senate, but in the House it is. I don't see that relationship because I'm not in a party. So that's probably going to color which committees will be available to me. And I recognize that that's going to have a relationship. And if the House is close, if it's if I'm the one who somehow makes the decision as to who has the majority, I suspect that I will have a much wider range of options for which committees I can serve on than not. Um, and there will be times when that vote is needed, and that vote becomes very, very, very powerful. And we see that um, in Manchin, who I don't care for the way he votes. I don't think it's particularly ethical. I suspect that he provides an awful lot of other Democrats cover, and I suspect that it is very lucrative to be the position of being the bad guy so that your colleagues don't have to. And I don't see many of the colleagues being as frustrated with him as perhaps the average citizen who pays attention to politics. But um, regardless of whether or not you love him, he ends up in a powerful position a lot of the time. And I'd like to think of it as powerful more than profitable. I'm not particularly interested in profit. If I have enough money to pay my bills, I don't I don't need to live on a yacht so that I can yell at protesters that they don't understand how difficult my life is. But I do think that that power can be used for good. Everything has a good side and a bad side. The good thing and the bad thing are the same thing. The thing that um, makes my husband not care if I'm not the one taking out the trash is the same thing that makes him not be the one who remembers to take out the trash. So those are the two sides of the same coin. So I suspect there will be years where I have a lot more influence than others, and I suspect that the longer I'm there, the more influence I have. I mean, that's how the House works. It's a seniority-based organization, and I think when you first get elected, people don't know what to feel about you or how to trust you if you're an independent. And I think over time, you build a reputation as having a very consistent voice that isn't neutral, but is relatively objective. I don't think of myself as neutral. I'm not neutral. I'm in it for us. I'm in it to make sure my kids have a place to live in 50 years that's not a trash bin. I'm in it to make sure that we all have representation that's responsive and listens. I'm in it to make sure that our laws aren't awful, and a lot of them are right now. So I definitely have a bias. I definitely have I'm not neutral, but I am objective in that I can look at facts, and I'm not colored by a party or a pressure system that makes me take a look at the facts and try to see them only through the lens of a group of people. I try to see them through how they're going to impact all of us. So the questions came back up, particularly municipal buildings and medical facilities. Um, Most of Maine's medical facilities are compliant or compliant ish. They may not be across the country, but in Maine, most of them are. A lot of them are new enough and have been built recently enough that they're fairly compliant. But a lot of them aren't. A lot of doctors do set up, in places that are unconventional buildings and they need help. I'm not aware of any specific ones that aren't compliant, but certainly if you have that information, I'll look into it for you. Municipal buildings, most of them have had to take some interesting steps to be compliant or compliant-ish. A lot of them aren't necessarily compliant. Sort of the extent of compliance for ADA is, well, we tried to put a bar in one of the bathroom stalls, and there's a ramp sort of kind of that gets very wet when it's raining and is hard to navigate in ice on the outside. And I think for some places it's going to be very difficult to get more compliance on that. You would think that an act that was made that many years ago would be fully compliant now, but it's not. And it's particularly a struggle in small towns that don't have the resources. The ADA puts most of the cost on to those businesses to come into compliance, and it's sort of an affirmative requirement. But though there are some resources, sorry, I have a dog who's trying to crawl into my lap, and he's very sweet, but he's like 90 pounds of sweet. So you can see his kind of like nose right there. Huh. Do you want to come up and say hi? Yeah. Do you want to be like, the emu that's all the rage right now. You can come up if you want. You want to come up? Yeah? No? Sorry, he's just going to interrupt whether we want him to or not. So I'll give him a moment of fame here. You can come up. I don't want you wearing laptop. You can come up over here. Is that okay? No, he's decided he's over it. He wants me to go throw a ball for him. Yes, in the mornings. So during the week, our routine is we wake up, we get everybody ready. Our boys go after a program. A lot of times that involves a bus. During the school year, definitely involves a bus. And he gets to play out in the yard with the ball for 20 or 30 minutes. So for me to be up at 8 and not throwing a ball for him is very upsetting to him apparently today. So what you needed, pup? Yeah, that's it. You know, you want to, you know, he just wants to. All right. So I apologize for the diversion. He's a very friendly dog. Sometimes Drama Cat will also jump through, attack me. So we have a very festive environment here. So yeah, I mean, I do think that we need to be making more federal funding available for accessibility. This isn't part of the ADA, but I have gotten several calls this year. I think we also need to be making legal services more available for folks with disabilities. Certainly, at least on a sliding fee basis, if not just available. There are a lot of situations for which people should have legal representation, that there are not attorneys available who can afford to take those cases. Most attorneys in Maine, you know, Maine doesn't have big law firms like some places. Maine doesn't have a lot of legal services like most places. We used to have a sliding fee legal services business. It went out of business at the beginning of the pandemic. We have Pine Tree Legal, which is grant funded predominantly, and it is incredibly limited in the cases it can take. The amount of calls it gets, it can't even return most of the calls, but the amount of calls it gets relative to the need is just, it's a huge gap. And a lot of that applies to housing, and a lot of people do call them with ADA issues. There's that, and there's Cumberland Legal Aid. Cumberland Legal Aid is staffed by students that are overseen by attorneys, and they take very few cases. And that's about it. There are some specified other legal services. So, for example, there is one group that, at least one group, there might be two, that does elder care services. That includes some legal services. There's a group that does some immigration work. Some of it is subsidized or reduced, but almost all of that's in Portland. Very little of it is outside of the Portland area. There are some grants that run, you know, for example, Pine Tree, in more broad areas. You know, there's Caring Unlimited, but I think they're only in York. There are some domestic violence agencies that have some limited legal connections, but a lot of those are, they tie to people who have experienced maybe domestic violence, and they're extremely restricted. You know, and I got a call in the last week from somebody who was referred to me, who wanted to know what they could do. They were elderly and they couldn't get out of the driveway, and their neighbor had torn up their driveway, and they didn't even know where to start in court. And I don't even work in that area, that practice area or that geographic area. And I didn't even know where to tell them to start. So I was able to give them just a tiny bit of guidance, but not much. We have a lot of people that get into problems that are like ADA compliance issues with landlords, with towns, and they don't have any legal representation. So we have a lot of folks that regularly need legal services that are extremely underserved in Maine. I suspect that's not just a Maine problem, but that would fix a lot of issues. So in Maine, you can get it legal help if your parental rights are being taken away, and potentially your own rights taken away in a guardianship through probate court. It's very limited, but that is available. And you can get help if you're below certain income levels, and the income levels are very low. So even people who don't qualify, most of them cannot afford an attorney. So for not all, but some criminal proceedings that, if they carry the risk of jail, because it impacts your constitutional rights. Um, and that's about it. There are some other pilot programs, but nothing that's easy to get to or accessible. And so a lot of folks don't have resources when they run up against things like ADA issues, or when they run up against things like, I don't know what to do about my family issue, or about my neighbor who's harassing me, or about any of that. We don't have services for those folks. We don't have legal services. We don't have social services. And those are actually a lot of the calls that are gotten. We should be providing those social support services. And, um, when we talk about how we rethink how we want policing to be, police handle a lot of these services now, and not in ways that actually help. When police get called out because somebody has tension because they can't get along with their landlord over an ADA issue, or they can't get along with their neighbor due to some sort of issue, or police get called for a wide range of stuff that has very little to do with policing. So we need to be looking at those budgets and seeing how we can rebalance them so that we have social services actually provided. It might make the police a little bit less money, but I think they'd have a much more pleasant work environment and be able to focus on the job they're supposed to be doing. I guess that was, again, a little bit of a rambling answer, pre-caffeine on a Saturday morning. But ADA issues are sticky and they're hard to address without knowing the particular facility and the budgeting issue. We definitely underfund them. We need to provide more options for recourse. We need to provide more social services options for recourse generally. Still getting used to looking at my camera, so I apologize if I'm kind of looking all over my cameras in a very awkward location. I've gotten the height right. I just have to get the camera right for these. So I hope that sort of answers the ADA questions. We still have had a few people join. If anybody else has questions, let me know. You can also email if you have something that's more specific or detailed that you're looking for. I've focused a lot of the ADA questions on things like, how to get in and out of buildings and et cetera. But there's a lot more to ADA compliance than just, do you have stairs? And I think that a lot of the Maine buildings do usually find a way generally to conquer the stair issue eventually. But there's a lot of other issues that pop up that are ADA compliance issues. And I think those need some extra help, and those definitely need some extra resources. And some buildings just are grandfathered, and it's going to be very difficult to find the resources that make sense without either making it cost prohibitive or, harming the integrity of the building structurally. I'm thinking of some of the buildings that are downtown, that are in little downtowns that are narrow, that are brick, that it would be very difficult if they haven't already figured out a way to put in a lot of the accommodations. It would be very difficult to go through and change doorways. Some buildings, there's just really no place to functionally put elevators or ramps. So we need more funding for that. It's got to address the smaller towns. But it's not just stairs. It's, are the doorways wide enough? Are there counter heights that meet expectations? A lot of it has to do with housing on top of municipal buildings and medical facilities. We are getting some new municipal buildings. York County is getting a consolidated court that I presume will be more compliant than some of the buildings are. Although this Alfred has some challenges. York, Biddeford, and Springvale are all new enough buildings that they are likely fully compliant. So if there's any other questions, feel free to drop in the chat. I'll talk for another minute or two. If any other questions come up, I have all the time today for you this morning, but I can't imagine at 8 o'clock you want to hang out for that long. You probably would like to go get your tea or coffee. And every once in a while, I have somebody join me from the West Coast, and then it's very early for you. So I don't see any other questions going in. The next opportunity to chat is going to be Tuesday. That those town halls are going to slowly become more structured. They probably are going to become more structured by September. I'll still have lots of opportunities for Q&A, but you'll see that particular series get a little bit more structured, a little bit more topical. I'm contemplating, while we're in this world where we're talking about disabilities, while we're talking about social services, one of the issues that I didn't touch on much, hold on, thank you for, I got this. So these notes don't always pop up. I click the box for them too, but they don't always. So it says, thank you for understanding some of the struggles Maine's disabled and elderly face every day. I appreciate your long-winded answer. So that's, it's somebody from Athens. So yes, and there's an Athens, Maine for anybody who's watching who's not in Maine. We have a lot of place names that we've borrowed. So we have Mexico, we have China, we have Norway, we have a lot of those, which comes up in a funny way. And when I get calls, because a lot of times people will be like, my husband took our children to China, and I have to be like, the country or the city, because there's very different consequences to those two things. So but one of the things that has come up this week, there was a vote last night. I haven't had a chance to dig into it, so if I haven't focused on it, this is why. There was a burn pit bill that failed in the Senate, and just veterans generally. We have a lot of veterans that are disabled, and it's not necessarily always physical disabilities. I'd like to see the ADA stuff become a little bit more broad and handle some of the emotional and mental disabilities too, because there are some things in buildings that can be very triggering to those. So some noises, some sounds, some colors, some sort of building and architectural choices can also be problems for people who have those disabilities. I think that we as a society have a burden to care for those who can't fully care for themselves, and to make it so they can do as much themselves as they can, and to give dignity. And for those who are beyond that capacity, we need to provide that care as well, and with dignity. I got an email years ago from someone who didn't have control over the fragrance of shampoos and lotions that was used on them. And if you can imagine living your entire life with a fragrance you can't stand, and you're bound to one place. So just those little pieces, I think that we have the responsibility to not just help people, but help people with dignity, with choice, with having as much autonomy as possible. And with vets, I think that I wouldn't say that we have more responsibility, but holy heck, if they got broken working for us, if we broke something in someone, or got put them in a position where they were harmed trying to help us, at a minimum they should be at that same standard of care and compassion. And that standard of care and compassion is too low for everybody who's in those categories. We do not care for our vulnerable well. We do not care for our elderly well. We do not care for our disabled well. We do not care for our medically fragile well. We do not care for our vets well. We like to put them on posters. We like to say nice things because words are very easy, but we don't put our money where our mouth is. We put our money in subsidizing billionaires and blowing things up. And that's just not where we should put our money. It's not a good community investment. So do we need a defense system? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Especially with the world sort of going the way it has been. But we also need to make sure that we're caring for the people within our own system who need help, who aren't receiving it, including the people who come back with disabilities after helping care for us. So we really need to be looking at those systems, and we don't do a good job of it. Neither party does. The Republicans seem to have taken the stance lately, or at least their votes reflect that they think that that's a responsibility of individual communities, which individual communities can't print money and don't really have the ability to bear that burden in almost all circumstances. And the ones that can bear that burden seem to find ways to get out of it. Um, and, a lot of the stuff that comes with the Democrats, part of it is the Republicans pushing back, and part of it is that a lot of Democrats fundamentally think that, the means testing has to be so restrictive that unless you are truly impoverished, I mean, in many places, if you have a car worth more than a couple $1,000s, you don't qualify for aid. You're expected to sell your vehicle. And that's very often in places where you can't get to your appointments without a vehicle, and it costs society more to provide transportation for you. So we have means testing that is so restrictive in most places that if we could just put more investment, and not even a huge amount more investment, just a little bit more investment in those areas, it would remove a phenomenal amount of stress, and it would actually help our economy probably function an awful lot better. So I'm always really disappointed when I see cuts to social services. It's a really easy place to cut. It's really easy to add money to the criminal budget because those people are bad, mean, awful people that just deserve it. You have to confine them. But most of those people, of a wide range and a vast majority of people who are in jails, are not in jails because they are truly malicious people. They are in jails because they got caught in a bad place structurally and didn't have a way out. And whether that meant that they chose to steal because they just didn't have something, they didn't have food. I mean, when we see inflation happen, we also see upticks in things like diapers being stolen. People who are stealing diapers because they have children that need diapers. They're not stealing diapers because it's a fun thing to run away with. You see a lot more people falling into depression. You see a lot more drug use. You see a lot more things that cause criminal activity, and it's just not great. So I would like to see us focus on reinvestment. Maybe that's what we'll talk about on Tuesday. If you have any other questions, you know how to find me. I try to answer questions on Twitter as they come in. I don't see everything. I get a ton of notifications. Sometimes I miss people's questions. Sometimes Twitter silences people. I don't necessarily see the tweets because you just don't show up. They've flagged some accounts as not high quality, whatever that means. So you can email me. I'm really easy to find on social media, and I will see you next Tuesday. Thank you for joining, and I hope you have a great Saturday. I think we're going to go out and find a pond to play in maybe, or we're getting into festival season. So pretty soon in Maine, every weekend is going to have some sort of fair or festival. Have a great Saturday.